One of the areas where AI doesn't always do such a good job is when you put it into an established code base and ask it to work on a feature, because it doesn't always pick up on the conventions and the kind of boundaries between modules and all those architectural concerns that you've spent time refining and enforcing over time. It doesn't necessarily observe those and certainly doesn't always stick to them. And that can be a real problem. It's a bit like if you drop a junior developer into a code base, ask them to go to town on a feature, and then expect them to, with no prior experience, magically pick up on what the conventions of the project are, where domain logic goes, which parts of the code base should call data, which shouldn't. So here's a really simple example. It's a project now. The specific architecture here is irrelevant. This one happens to be layers. I would probably, in my projects, be more likely to be using vertical slices. But the more important thing here from an AI point of view is, can it detect that architecture? Can it understand it by looking at examples of what's already there? And then when you ask it to do a feature, will it, adhere to those principles? And in a tiny project like this, it probably would. So you've got your layers, the classic thing where, web should only really call application. Application ultimately is going to interact with the domain. Infrastructure shouldn't get involved until we're the rubber hits the road and we're actually saving to a database. And there's rules about which layer can call which other layer. AI can easily come along and violate this because, especially in a bigger code base, it's going to try and get to where you tell it to go to. And that could involve, for example, doing something like this where it accidentally just completely violates all those layers and says, I know, I'm going to throw in a quick query of the database right in the component, layers be damned. And this would be annoying, but the challenge is that it's not just annoying. If you're getting into a real cadence of AI generating code and you're reviewing lots of code, and we all know that takes its toll, there comes a point where you just miss stuff. And that one might be too obvious to miss, but someone's going to let that through. And suddenly you have a problem because the next time AI comes along, it sees this pattern and it thinks, that's the pattern that you're using. I'll just do the same thing. But this is all avoidable if we enforce those boundaries, if we enforce the architecture. And a really neat way of doing that, which I've used recently, is to use NetArchTest or similar to basically say, look, these tests have to fail if that happens. It's quite simple to set these up, actually. It's just a case of saying, for example, in this case, the types in this assembly, the domain assembly, should not have a dependency on infrastructure. So that enforces that the domain doesn't know how, an entity in the domain doesn't know how it's going to be saved, for example. And if I run these tests now, they would fail. But in a way, it's even more useful to have AI run them. So if I just go to Claude in this example, but it could be whatever your AI tool of choice is, and we just say, please run the tests. Now, chances are you'd probably bed that into your actual development process. So you'd have AI work on the code, and then you'd have it run these tests at the point where it thinks it's done. And it's going to run these, and with any luck, it's going to say, oh, actually, I made a mistake here. I did something that I shouldn't have done. Let me fix it for you. So it's found the two failing tests, which is that the components shouldn't have a dependency on EF core, so we shouldn't go directly to the database. And they shouldn't even depend on infrastructure, because in this example, they should be going through the application layer. So and we can go ahead and say, yes, please go ahead and fix that. And it will locate, I think there's a service method that does what it wants to do. It will call that instead, and it'll basically fix this problem. So what can you do with this? Well, the thing to always hold in your head is, well, what is enforceable and to some extent deterministic? So we can say, actually, architecture, these are rules, and those rules must not be violated. And if you can say that out loud, and then there's a tool like, in this case, that allows you to enforce those boundaries, then give it to your AI as a constraint that it must run these tests. Put these tests in your CI/CD process, so it can't ignore them even if it wants to. But the thing is, as you've seen here, AI will pick this up and it will correct itself almost straight away within a few minutes of putting that code in, as long as it's running these tests.